everyone, we are going to get started here in just a few minutes, but I do want to give a little time for the room to populate. While we're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, everyone should be seeing my slides right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and start looking about getting started because we have a jam-packed program for today. Well, welcome to our June 2025 C2C Care webinar. Today, we're going to be doing Preserving Our Past as Place-Based Care Work. We're going to be running from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern, just as an FYI to everyone. And with that, we'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Robin Bauer-Kilgo. I am the C2C Care Coordinator. I'm located just outside of Washington, D.C. in Silver Spring, Maryland. I am going to go ahead and welcome our audience and everyone here. Feel free, you have access to the chat, and I'm going to talk about some tech stuff here in a minute, but feel free to go ahead and say hello in the chat and say where you're from, because that's always fun to kind of see where people are located across the country. You can also talk about the weather. That's a popular subject. I know here in Maryland, it's really hot. So I'm hoping it's going to cool off a little bit next week for sure. This is our home on the web, connecting to collections.org. We had a website refresh a few months ago, so I hope everyone has been enjoying the new look on our website. On that website, you will be able to view all of our past webinars. C2C Care has been around for over 10 years, so you can do some really good deep dives into our past programming and to our future programming. We also do a deep dive with courses. So those are a little bit of a deeper look into certain collections topics. So I would encourage you to look at that as well. And a link to our community. The community is a place where you can actually post questions to a fabulous group of volunteers who will then take a look at it and reach out to experts, to go get your answers to direct care questions related to collections. So if you have a question about anything, maybe you're having a pest challenge or a challenge on how to store something, I would encourage you to post to that community. It's a protected spot where you can go and get some really great information, again, from a fabulous group of volunteers who are very fun to work with. I also wanted to do a quick update on C2C Care. This resource has had a long history of being supported by FAIC, the Foundation of Advancement and Conservation, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, alongside individual donors. As many of us have known, our IMLS funding was terminated in April of 2025, and since then, FAIC has been most appreciative of the Samuel H. Kress Foundation and individual donors who have stepped up to help support us as we kind of navigate how to keep this vital program moving forward. We have, because of these fabulous donors, we're going to be able to do our programming through the end of the year. So thank you to them, a heartfelt thank you to them. But we also would like you to consider that if you've benefited from Connecting to Collections Care, please consider a gift today. So you can scan that QR code and go to the donate screen. So again, C2C Care has had a long history. Even if you're able to donate just a few dollars to help keep the program alive and kicking while we kind of investigate other resource funding and all that other stuff, it would be appreciated. So a huge thanks to all the donors who have stepped forward, and again, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. We do also have two homes online outside of our website, which is the Facebook, which is at C2C Care, and on LinkedIn. On those two sites, we do go ahead and post upcoming notes about programming. So I would encourage you to follow both of those outlets if you can. And finally, again, we're working on our scheduling right now through the end of the year, but on July 29th, we do have an announcement of a program called Contained Curiosities, Managing of Solids and Liquids in Collections. We were just talking kind of back in the green room about how a lot of small and mid-sized institutions who are our primary audience have these mystery liquids within their collections. And the question is always what to do with them. How do I deal with them? How do I get rid of them? Who do I talk to? So if you join us on July 29th, you'll be able to find some fun information on how to deal with that. We have a speaker coming in who's had quite a long history on dealing with these items. So I would encourage you to register for that program if you are able. Couple of quick tech reminders. We have the chat box, as I mentioned previously, and it looks like people are using quite handily. So again, you can use that to communicate to each other, or if you're having a technical difficulty, please put it in the chat box and I will do my best to help you from my office. We also have enabled the Q&A box. The Q&A box is really there for you to ask questions of our speakers. So if at any point you have a question, put it in the Q&A box. It helps us track kind of the questions as the program goes along. We are also recording today's program. So if you do have to step out early, no worries. We're going to be posting it just a few days after the event concludes. And we've also enabled captioning. So we have a captioner working diligently away to capture what we're saying. So if you'd like that service, please hit the CC button and you will be able to see the captioning happening. So with that, I am going to stop my share and introduce our speakers today in our program. Today's program is going to offer insights from preservation professionals on the type of care work it takes to preserve our past using similar techniques as archivists. Our speakers are Rita Cofield, who's Associate Project Specialist at the Getty Conservation Institute, and Decca Hussein Wetzel, who's Historic Preservationist and co-host and producer of Urban Roots, to come talk to us today. So Decca and Rita, feel free to take over, and I will see you all in the Q&A period at the conclusion of today's program.
Thanks, Robin.
Thanks, Robin. Okay, so I've got the screen up here. I'll let Rita introduce herself first, since she's first on the screen on the left here, and then I'll introduce myself.
Awesome. Thanks, Decca. Thank you, Robin, for inviting us to chat with your C2C care community about the work that we do. We'll just give you a brief overview of how we started our careers and then how those careers have contributed to care work.
Yeah, so I see a lot of familiar places in the chat, so it's really cool. I definitely, I think Robin gave us a good little introduction there, but you keep our, well, you'll get this material afterwards anyway, but you can see our email addresses and it'll be at the end as well. So if you guys want to contact us, you can.
Okay, so my name is Rita Cofield. I have an undergraduate degree in architecture and planning from Howard University, and an advanced degree in heritage conservation from USC. I think, Decca, if you can, there you go, thanks. From USC, and my first preservation challenge actually started in my community. It began as a response to a call from community leaders in the Watts neighborhood when a beloved and important community space that you see pictured there that's owned by the city was threatened with potential demolition. So the What's Happening Cultural Center is a postmodern building that was designed by two Black architects, Robert Kennard and Arthur Silvers. And it was built for a Black arts education organization that was dedicated to community empowerment called the Mafundi Institute. And Mafundi means Swahili, means artisans in Swahili. So the Cultural Center was one of the most prominent cultural centers in Los Angeles from 1970 to 1975. It was the only cultural center of its kind in any Black community anywhere in the US at the time. And the Mafundi Institute closed its doors in 1975, but the building has remained a community anchor. And thanks to community efforts, it's now locally designated as a historic cultural monument, as well as listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And also it received a Conserving Black Modernism grant from the National Trust's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund in 2023. And so now the community is working with the city to get attention and raise funds for it to be restored and revived as a community cultural arts center. So at the beginning of this work, my work in the community with this building was around the same time that global discussions around systemic racism took place in 2020. This discussion also sparked conversations within the preservation community worldwide that focused on inequities within our current designation system and the changes that were needed to address them. So it became clear that Getty and LA City Planning's department, LA City Planning Department's Office of Historic Resources could contribute to that discussion by building on their previous partnership working on Survey LA. And Survey LA was a project that began in 2010 where the city surveyed over 880,000 parcels that resulted in a citywide historic context statement, identifying important themes to the city's history and development, as well as buildings and places that were related to those themes. So the outcome was also several cultural ethnic frameworks, including the African American History of LA Context document. Despite the efforts of Survey LA and the city of LA's existing list of designated historic landmarks still didn't adequately reflect and still don't adequately reflect the richness and breadth of the African American experience in Los Angeles. So the African American Historic Places LA project, or AHPLA, was launched in 2022 as a continuation of a joint project of Survey LA between the city and Getty to address that dilemma. And I was hired to lead the day-to-day activities of that project. I wear multiple hats as a community organizer, working on the Mafundi building or the What's Happening Cultural Center, and also this project that's very steeped in community support and community voices. So HPLA will rely even more on community input and the guidance of a 15-member local advisory committee. One of the main project activities will be updating the African American History of LA Context document and bringing forward community-led sites for designation from the existing context document. We've already designated 5 sites to date, and when the document is updated, we'll hopefully have brand new sites to designate. Another activity of the project is to work with 3 historically African American neighborhoods to identify better preservation strategies that'll highlight and celebrate the unique heritage of those communities, going outside of just designating historic sites. And those communities are Pacoima, Oakwood, and the Central Avenue corridor. The project will also look at the practice and policies of preservation through an anti-racist lens that'll hopefully yield different tools for capturing a fuller story of our shared histories. And although the focus of HPLA is on African American heritage, we see the project as an opportunity to rethink issues plaguing other underrepresented communities and heritages, and the barriers that prevent associated sites from being identified and designated. The hope is to tap into solutions that can be adapted and used as a model in other places locally and internationally. And I'll hand it over to Decca for her introduction.
Yeah, thank you. So for me, I kind of have these things kind of showing backwards here because I'll start off by saying that my education was founded within, I kind of started in the planning field. So I have a undergraduate in urban planning from the University of Cincinnati. And then, it was, I don't know, 2012, challenging to find jobs, worked for AmeriCorps, did a lot of different things. Decided that, I wanted to try something a little bit tangential to planning that wasn't exactly planning because I really was interested in history and architecture. And so then I went to the University of Oregon's Master Historic Preservation program. And I also did a certificate in nonprofit management, which kind of comes into play into some of the stuff that I do now. So it's interesting because after I graduated from the program in Oregon, I I started working in the private sector and I realized it wasn't for me. It was like cultural heritage management, and I was always more interested in museums and collections and oral histories and archival stuff, and whether that's photographs or newspapers. I spent a lot of time in newspapers as a preservationist, and so some of that ended up leading me to starting my own podcast, Urban Roots, and I'll talk more about that in a few moments. And then the nonprofit that kind of came shortly after that. But kind of going back to my education in about I think it was just like 2 years ago, I started the PhD program in historic preservation at Columbia. So I do live in New York now. I moved from Cincinnati to New York. And the program actually is really new for anybody who is a preservationist or is familiar. they might know that Columbia has started the first PhD program in historic preservation. So, and they actually we just graduated our first PhD graduates from the program. So, it's been really great. Now I'm able to kind of explore the storytelling aspects of the work that I have really started doing with the podcasting and the nonprofit, which again I will share more shortly.
Thanks, Decca. So for Decca and I, the care work that we do as preservation professionals working in the built environment are anchored in uplifting and centering community voices. We've been gifted to hold space for stories, stories about our past, and stories that connect us, and entrusted by communities to use those place-based stories to ensure that um, their long-term survival, and to prevent the deterioration in their physical and cultural identity, and to manage their change for future generations to use and appreciate. So with the next few slides, we'll talk about our care work. So communities have been saving their spaces before preservation became a formalized profession. And it's up to us as preservation and conservation professionals to recenter their voices. I can't do what I do without centering community voice. So Survey LA was one of the most comprehensive surveys done in any major city, yet the list of historic sites in Los Angeles associated with African Americans is still around 4% of its approximately 1,360 historic cultural monuments. So this doesn't begin to represent the depth of their history in LA. We have a lot of work to do, not only to center the voices of African Americans, but of women's history, of LGBTQ plus history, First Nations history, and more history that will be discovered as we center community voices. So AHPLA is centering community voices and giving them agency for how to bring forward sites that they think are significant through shadowing opportunities. This is where interested community members can get to help our consultant with the designation process as much as their experience and their interest allows. We had a project kickoff in 2024 at St. Elmo Village, which is an important site, and that's now being designated an important site for Black cultural arts in the 60s and 70s. We had our kickoff there in 2024 that had a curated guest of community leaders across Los Angeles. It was full of activities to connect and share stories and to build enthusiasm and awareness for the project. The project is committed to having both graduate and undergraduate internship opportunities throughout the life of the project. We do office hours to help community to stay engaged with the project. We also have an online survey to gain responses conveniently. And we're doing listening sessions for community to share place-based stories. The other work that Dec and I do to center community voices are the podcasts we participate in, lead, and support. Our resource list, as Decca mentioned, will have links to the several podcasts that we're involved with. And one that I didn't get to put on there, but I'll pop in the chat, is Getty's Recurrent podcast that focuses on stories of cultural heritage. I'll turn it over to Decca to talk more about urbanist media.
Yeah. There's also, like Rita mentioned, the podcast, that one of the ones that we do together is called Preservation for the People, and it's been really fun, and that is on our resource list, and I really hope you guys there's a lot on the resource list, so carefully go through it, take your time. But it's a lot of really great stuff. So to kind of share where I started and how I got to urbanist media, or how I came to figure out that an organization was where I wanted to kind of get to. So the Urban Roots podcast was a precursor to urbanist media, actually. The organization, right? So organization, urbanist media, podcast, Urban Roots. The org was founded because of the overwhelming community, like positive community response to the podcast, to the stories that we were able to amplify. Each episode uses narrative, nonfiction style audio documentary to preserve place through story. So when we began, and it started with me and my podcast partner, Vanessa Quirk. Vanessa is a journalist. She's a journalist background. I came in with the preservation history research, and all of that. And I now could call myself a podcaster, but when I started, I was, and even actually still on the podcast, you'll hear me say historic preservationist or something. Um, the way we like to do that was to we thought that we could just utilize existing oral histories to talk about stories related to Black and Indigenous and Brown populations. But we realized that those types of oral histories were not really represented very well in traditional archives. And the first season started in Cincinnati, and there was a handful of things that we were able to find. But in terms of really like diving into the community, I mean, so there was like certain African American figures that might have had oral histories, but not things that related to place as much, and not things that explained the kind of ways that people had experienced life throughout, especially the mid 20th century. And so that's when we realized the importance of partnering with local community organizations and repositories to record oral histories for the podcast. And then when it came to that work, we were like, well, recording these histories is not enough. We want to ensure that these collections last. So if we were to do the recordings, we would share them with repositories, but we also really value, and this is the care work component, we value the people who've provided their voices for our podcast. And so we like to give them copies as well that they can keep for their family collections, or they use them however really they want to, in addition to us including that in the podcasting. And so, we feel that this is like public history media storytelling platform is really, really popular. And, it gets people excited out there in the general public. So it's kind of like this public history work, and it's sort of like urban planning work, and it's sort of historic preservation work. And it's a lot of that because we talk about the displacement and the types of planning policies that occurred during especially the mid-century, to make it that it just talks about the truth, right? And that was something that when we started the podcast in 2020, that was something that we realized was missing from the conversations. And so there's a lot of different things that inspire us, but really it's the people and the stories, and then we've kind of found different ways as an organization to do this work, because the narrative podcasting can take a lot of time. It takes financing, it takes a lot. So we've also found ways to partner with like Cincinnati Public Radio, and there's some links in the resource about that. But we've done like Juneteenth Cincinnati Shorts, and just creating short form content that helps kind of illuminate those histories. And I wanted to kind of speak a little bit on, since a lot of you guys are collections folks, I wanted to talk a little bit about a collection that we've been able to work with that already existed. So in the Portland, Oregon area, Vanport Mosaic is a great example of really work that where they've been collecting oral histories for nearly 10 years in the lost city of Vanport. The next slide I'll play a couple of videos, and that will kind of give you a good understanding. Like the two videos will actually explain this history. Me and Vanessa will explain, and then the next video will explain how the folks through the oral histories have what they experienced. Because it was temporary wartime housing built in the 1942. You can kind of see this little timeline here. There was wartime life, and then there was a big flood in 1948, and then there was an aftermath, and people had to leave and get displaced into Portland. This is definitely actually work I started when I was at the University of Oregon, is like unpacking this history. So it's been really nice to kind of come full circle and work with Vanport Mosaic to talk more about this and kind of get this stuff out there. This is a current project like we are working on that's not quite published yet, but we got some stuff for you guys. So okay, if you guys cannot hear it or Robin, let me know, but I'm going to play this.
It was a temporary wartime housing campus, basically a city built on the floodplain between Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon during World War II.
Right. It was made so that the workers of Kaiser shipyards could come work on the ships for the war effort and also live nearby with their families. And it attracted workers from across the country. It was white Americans, Black Americans, Japanese Americans, Indigenous Americans, all stripes.
And surprisingly, only the residential areas were segregated. The common areas and the schools were integrated, which was very unusual for the time period.
Yeah, especially in Oregon, which was a very segregated place, right?
And the diversity did help create a pretty tight-knit community there.
Unfortunately, however, in 1948, the community was essentially wiped out in moments by a massive flood.
We were worried, but the Army Corps of Engineers and the city of Portland told us that the dikes were safe. And we took them at their word.
There was a flyer that says, "Don't panic, the dike will not break, and we'll warn you, give you plenty of warning."
Well, that 48 hours came in about 8 hours.
All of a sudden, one kid came in, ran up to the front and said the dike broke. The water was coming. We were driving as fast as we could. People were running and screaming. I looked back and I saw a wall of water behind the car, and I realized how close we were to being washed away.
And so when the flood came, we made a run for it. We didn't have anything, nothing.
Yeah, so kind of goes to show a little bit sneak peek of what the fuller story would be, because we're working on this as like a fuller podcast episodes. But yeah, I mean, happy to answer any kind of questions about this work, this care work. But the important kind of component here, especially thinking about what care work means, is that it takes time for us to make sure we're getting these stories right. And for those who have recorded their oral histories and are alive, you know, it's not just that we're working with the people who are like the organizational leaders of Vanport Mosaic, but we're also talking with the people who are kind of stewards of these histories. And so this is also complicated because we are trying to do a 3-part series, and it's going to be, you know, African American. It's kind of interweaving and not like specifically one story after another, but it's African American history, Indigenous American history, and Japanese American history, and like, you know, there's a lot more to this than meets the eye, and it's really eye opening, because from what I had been able to unpack by writing papers on these the kind of history of housing in Portland, you know, all of these communities, all of these demographics experience a different kind of discrimination that started before, like that started before because, you know, Japanese Americans were forced to go into essentially concentration camps, and that's like a huge, you know, really important component that we want to make sure that we're diving into and telling the story in a very appropriate way. But like I myself, Vanessa, we do not, you know, we're not Japanese Americans. We don't have Japanese heritage, and so that's why it's really important for us as our process with podcasting in this way. We actually do, and when I say we're working with people, like we are diving in and having conversations, but we also allow folks to listen to these episodes when they're done. We give them cuts throughout our process so that, again, we're making sure that we're using their voices in the right way. Another example that I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about is stressing the importance of collaborating with the smaller institutions, including museums and churches. This is an example from the project that kind of was resulted in a couple different things, but podcasting wise, it is season 3. We did a little series on Decatur, Alabama. And so it all started from when the city of Decatur received an underrepresented communities grant from MPS to hire a Secretary of Interior qualified historic preservation consultant. So that's why they hired Urbanist Media to develop 2 historic context statements, one on African Americans and one on women's history. And then the other part of that RFP that they had submitted to MPS was to produce 2 podcast episodes that correlate to that history in some way. So the care work the approach that I wanted to kind of mention here, this photograph represents how we worked closely and collaborated with First Missionary Baptist Church, the pastor on the far left, and members like the woman who I've got the microphone in front of is an example. And also we went out and talked with people who were residents of the local Black communities that existed and that didn't exist, because there was a ton of erasure that happened through different types of urban renewal projects. So in order to understand those lost histories and in order to find a way, part of the benefit of a historic context statement is that you can talk about places that don't exist anymore. And that helps us as preservationists understand like what types of restorative actions might need to be done to redress those essentially indecencies. And so this is a similar framework that we use to do this with the African American historic context statement and the podcast episode we use for the women's history one as well. All right, to Rita. Oh, you're muted, Rita.
Yes, I'll start again. When people think of preservation, they often think of freezing something in time. So Webster's defines preservation as the activity or process of keeping something valued alive, intact, or free from damage or decay. I think that's a pretty good definition. Yet people still think that there can be absolutely no changes once the subject is officially designated as historic. And this has kept many people from applying for landmark status for their sites and even opposing the designation of important sites such as the Watts Happening Cultural Center. So the picture on the right is of me applying a handmade mix of mud plaster to help preserve the adobe walls of a structure in New Mexico called El Zaguán. It was a historic complex started in 1854 and just continued to be built upon. I also tested the exterior colors of the adobe for future work. I had a lot of fun doing some hands-on work there. So when people understand that our work is to manage the change and protect the most important feature of the historic site that help people tell a story, they usually come around and soften to the idea of designation. So not only storytelling and uplifting community stories, but actually physically managing the change of the built environment is some of the care work that we do. And how we care for culturally significant sites in the face of opposition and or misunderstanding is often complicated and precarious. So most importantly, Decca talked about truth of stories or telling the truth. So when there's opposition, it's important to tell the truth about the history. It's, not about whose history. I mean, history is the most honest form of communication. You can take that history and spin it and confuse it. But if you just tell the story, tell the full story from those multiple angles and stick to the content of those stories tend to draw us in and connect us to one another, often rising above all the misunderstandings and the political minutia that's involved. For HPLA, the project holds accountable those with the power to designate sites by first giving agency to the community to tell their own stories. And in community work, It's holding city officials accountable when community brings forward concerns of threatened community sites like the What's Happening Cultural Center, to uplift those community stories and the history of the building as a way to educate and create civic engagement. And of course, DECA uses her podcast as a platform to do that work. So we'd like to end our presentation with some calls to action. I have a feeling that I don't need to tell you folks that connecting objects to their stories, maybe even with living ancestors using oral histories, centers the object holder so that humanity is central to the collection. So the picture on the left is just of a traditional cultural garment on display at some museum, along with a picture connecting the garment to its cultural history. So imagine how much more enriching the experience when objects are connected to a real life story or a person. Connecting stories is also beneficial for the object. The Museum of Us in San Diego brought in a traditional Maasai warrior to give advice on caring for a traditional Maasai spear, therefore decolonizing its collection. The California African American Museum has created a relationship with a gallery in Leimert Park called Art and Practice, where curated exhibits are shared between the two. And the picture on the right is from a YouTube video of the Johnson Publishing Archives, housed at the Getty Research Institute. And the JP Company is the most comprehensive collection of Black culture in the 20th century, depicting stories of Black excellence, countering the barrage of negative images. So GRI is collaborating with the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture to digitize this collection. And also the collection is being made available as soon as it becomes digitized. So these are larger and more well-known entities, but they are smaller, homegrown community archivists that have stories to share, photographers that have stories to share, that can help us understand our collective history. Hiring local partners to build archives, including oral history archives within larger institutions, can help balance the power dynamic and give people, communities, and cultures, various cultures, a chance to tell their own stories.
And then I wanted to speak a little bit to amplifying oral histories as a call to action. So if you are already developing or have an oral history collection, centered on place-based storytelling, I urge you to consider reaching out to Urbanist Media or connecting with us and talking about, what the future of some of these collections can look like beyond sometimes living in a box, right? So Urbanist Media collaborates with mission-aligned individuals and organizations to preserve place through story to promote equity in the built environment, whether that's through traditional methods like National Register nominations or public history approaches, such as audio and audiovisual media. And so preservation methods, right? National Register nominations, historic context statements. These are ways to utilize oral histories and actually use preservation as a tool to help. And preservation has various levels of, and feel free to reach out to Rita and I to talk about this more offline. But like preservation has different levels of like National Register versus local landmark and other types of nominations. And then those kind of come with different types of protections for properties. Local listings are usually the ones that are most equipped to help protect properties. And it changes from city to city and based off of how they want to approach that. But that is actually become a really important part of the work that we do at Urbanist Media. But then when there's properties that don't exist anymore, we also don't want to just ignore that. We want to find a way to amplify and share and care for those types of histories. And so again, we want to ensure that oral histories don't remain confined to archives, gathering literal or metaphorical dust. By actively sharing and interpreting these stories, especially those from Black and Brown and other historically marginalized communities, we can resist gatekeeping and make a space for these narratives to be visible, valued, and accessible to the public. I think the just Juneteenth Cincinnati shorts that we've been doing, Urbanist Media's been doing with Cincinnati Public Radio is a really good example of that. And in other ways, we've been able to get on the radio as well. But I think, these kind of highlights here on the screen just show it's not like, here's the marketing that's gone with the work. And that's not at all what it is. It's like how the podcast actually actively really is there to support communities of color. And then the last kind of call for action here is like whether you made a podcast before or have dabbled in audio or like a full-fledged radio master, our team can help you take your work to the next level. And so we collaborate again with community organizations to produce new sound-rich Urban Roots episodes and short form content. But really, like the way our narrative podcasting works is that we can't do it without the collaboration and the connections that help us kind of tell stories in different cities, right? So I lived in Cincinnati for a long time. I have a very strong, like a set of resources and groups of people there that I have made very important long-term connections with. I'm in New York now, and I'm doing the same thing here. But I truly believe that the way the Urban Roots podcast is most successful is by helping highlight and share stories of, ideally, I would love to go to every American city or major American city. It doesn't even, and it's not necessarily about it being a completely urban space. I mean, there's always conversations about how the rural spaces have kind of helped balance or impact other cities, right? So, so there's a lot to me really feeling as an urban planner that the history of each city is unique enough to be able to help keep the story going of there's been displacement and erasure, and it's happened in different ways. And then we need to kind of look at that in a very specific way so that, and this is kind of where I bring in my PhD work, right? It's like, well, then figuring out how to redress these historical inequalities through planning and preservation policy today. Because if you know anything about historic preservation policy, it kind of started in 1966, and a lot of things have not changed since then. So, so yeah, we just really want to encourage you all to, if you have questions about how to get involved in planning or in preservation in the ways that Rita and I have. If you want to learn how to do any of this work, kind of taking it a step forward. And for me especially, it's both about the tangible but also the intangible. Please reach out to us. We're always happy to talk and just consult or just chat and just kind of help really everybody understand that there's always additional care work that can be done to really, especially for larger institutions, to figure out ways to kind of be more hyper local. And with that, we want to thank you for taking the time to stick here with us, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have. And here's our information, and then you'll also have access to that information in the resources.
Thank you guys for that. That was great. So I've gone ahead and put in the chat a link to the resource page and then also a link to our survey, because I always like to throw the surveys out there as soon as I can so people will fill them out, because as we all know, we love to do surveys in our world and to take what the audience has to say for future considerations. So I'm going to go ahead and open the floor for questions from the audience. And Decca, feel free to stop sharing your screen whenever you're ready. We will make sure to pass along your contact information and have that available for people as well. But while we're kind of waiting for questions, something that you had mentioned made me think about how I did my first master's degree back in the middle 2000s, which is like forever ago now. And it was in public history and historic administration. So I took an oral history class. And I was just sitting there when you were talking, thinking about how when I learned oral histories, it was to preserve them. That is what we did. We put them on, I think it was still cassette tapes, that dates me. And then basically it was, you put in storage, right? And how just everything has changed so much to be like, no, we need to provide better access for these things. Putting them on that shelf to gather both types of dust is a good point. But I feel like a lot of folks from our community, they want to start these programs, but they're I don't want to say nervous, but they're really thinking about how do I approach these communities to even start the conversation, especially if they are not from the communities. Like you guys mentioned, going and talking to Japanese communities, or someone like myself. My first job out of grad school was with a tribal community, so it was a little intimidating to walk into a tribal community and be like, hey, we want to record you. So do you have any recommendations for how to approach that? Kind of what's the best attitude? Just any kind of tips or tricks you've experienced or learned about? And either one can take it.
Dick, I'll let you go first, and then, in terms of our listening sessions, I can talk about that, but I'll let you take the.
Well, it's interesting because as you're saying this, and I don't know if this was somebody else had this other question, but it was kind of like, any tips from individuals about from underrepresented communities, like how do you engage with people about sensitive topics? And I think a lot of that is to like be honest. Like if you're not a person of color going into a place that is filled with people that don't necessarily look like you, it can be kind of a hurdle. And so that's usually why I say hire somebody from the community to a community steward, identify who those people are. So if you need to have those conversations first to identify who the best person is. I mean, you are not necessarily going to be the one identifying that out of the blue. Like you might be having conversations and then somebody says, this is the person you need to talk to. This is the person you need to talk to. And that happens so much more often, and people are really, really willing to talk. And to just say, like, don't be too afraid to dive into that.
Yeah, and you're gonna get pushback, and don't be afraid to mess up, make a mistake, own it, and keep moving forward. I think the most important thing in going out to communities, even the communities that look like us. I'm from Florence Firestone and I work in Watts. I don't know folks in Pacoima. So when we go out to work with those communities, the first thing is just being genuine. Like, communities, especially marginalized communities, can see when you are not genuine, and when your project is just the object, when you're focused on the objective of the project and not focused or caring for the people, so they can see and they can tell, because they're very sensitive to that. So just being honest and genuine, and even when you catch yourself, just sort of come back to the table, and working with other, other Black communities. It's like letting them take the lead almost. We have a project to do, but if I need to fall back and listen to, what's happening in the moment, we have to do that. People use this phrase, working at the speed of trust. So whatever that looks like. And Becky, you talked about, in terms of, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. It's not COVID brain, but had bronchitis brain, maybe. There is going out into different communities, and really wanting to know, and here you said localized. So finding people to pay, that are in the community. So with HPLA, we have a 15-member advisory committee that gets paid, but we also, as we're working with the individual communities, we have what we're calling steering committee members. And those are 5 in each of the Pacoima, the Central Avenue corridor, and Oakwood. Those steering committee members connect us to the larger community. So they are getting paid to participate. So it's finding local knowledge. It's finding those knowledge bearers that are that are steeped in the community, that want to help you with it, but will also keep you on track, saying, yeah, you were off base there, or you need to talk to this person, or connecting you with other community members.
I think that having that community aspect of it is so incredibly important, and looking at them as like, you guys are equal partners. In fact, you're probably, if you're not that community, you're almost like the lesser partner. Like you're just kind of sitting there going like, you need to direct me into what is the, what directions do we need to go to, and to make sure that that representation is weighted obviously towards the community you're working with, because that's where it should be. You know what I mean? Like, I think I'm lucky enough where I was seeing that change happen. You know what I mean? As I was going through my career, it's in the late 90s, mid 00s, like you could start seeing that change. And now I feel like even with current climate, we still see a lot of people still fighting that fight of being like, no, really think about who you're working with. So it's really nice to hear kind of that aspect of what you guys are talking about. And also paying people. I think that's incredibly important, is paying people for their time and compensation, and making sure compensation is included. We do have a couple questions that have come in, real tech questions, but I love tech questions. So we'll see if we can tackle them and see what kind of answers we can come up with. So Deco, what's your take on format for the output? So I think this is interesting, because this is always kind of a, sticking point, is looking at the tech aspect of these projects. Is it best to duplicate across media types? How do you make choices around format? And they're thinking of like kind of what you showed, TikTok clips, oral histories, all that kind of stuff. So how do you kind of make those decisions as you're looking at a project? Oh, you're muted, just a heads up.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. I feel like sometimes I want to answer like a couple questions at a time, because I'm realizing like they're linked. Somebody else kind of asked a question about like how a low budget museum would could start out to do this type of work. And so I'm going to lump those two answers together, because in terms of the output, we started with the podcast, like it was just audio format. And then podcasting started to get video oriented, which like I'm fundamentally against. Like I think that this is like a huge, like that, and like celebrity podcasts are kind of one of the biggest hindrances to people finding independent podcasts. But then I'm, especially with really any community that we've worked with that has especially older populations, and when you're recording oral histories, you want to be speaking to some of the older folks as as a priority, because they that just like longevity wise, I think it's something that's like a reality. And so to make it accessible for them too, one of the things that I realized is that, well, almost everybody knows YouTube. So make sure the podcast is on YouTube, but then, because then there's this like whole younger audience of people who really like, oh my gosh, all the kids, all my nieces and nephews, they're just like all about YouTube shorts. And I'm like, well, okay. So the TikTok format and the shorts format is pretty similar. So actually we do actually put more on YouTube, and it just happened to be that those two videos were on TikTok. I think it's really hard to be always constantly posting on all the platforms, but we're lucky that we do have some interns at Urbanist Media that help us both take the audio and put it into video, as well as taking that and putting it on different platforms. I think you can pick and choose which platforms you want to use, right? So for us, it's Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn, because the work we do is so professional oriented. But then also like we will put it on TikTok, and also getting it out on the newsletter. So I guess the reality is though is that YouTube is like one of the most useful places to put things. And we've evolved as well, as like I've submitted some grant opportunities that I was awarded to take the podcast and literally like the first season of the podcast on African American history in Cincinnati, there's an episode. The first episode, we collaborated with a local organization that has a lot of older photographs, and were able to put those together so that we could create that like mini documentary, so it's visual as well. And then I also kind of did this in a more direct way with especially the stories from the neighborhoods in Cincinnati. So that would be the latter 3 episodes, and talked about urban renewal and displacement specific to the highways that came through, that are 3 highways that are actually not, or I guess maybe more so 2 highways that are not talked about. So we talked about I-71 coming, or I-75 coming through Cincinnati, and that displaced the West End community. But then there's always been less information out there about I-71 and I-74 coming through the other, some other African American communities. And to be fair, like, we have not comprehensively done stories on every single African American neighborhood that's been impacted in Cincinnati. That is something we would love to do, but it takes additional support, and I also do really value popping into other places. So kind of like that second kind of question, which I think, oh, it's in the answered section now. For a low budget museum, like, how do you figure out how to do this in an effective way? Well, this is kind of why Urbanist Media exists, is so that, you know, and if there are other organizations that are local that you might find that might be useful to connect with, then please do. Like, I'm not saying just like call me and hire me, but like, as a museum, you might not have that technical expertise. So don't try to create this technical expertise you don't have. Just reach out and we'll figure out ways to make it work. So for short videos, like, we've just haven't published it yet, but if you do follow us on Patreon, you will get a sneak peek. We have a blackpast.org video that we've collaborated with them on, about an Indigenous Black woman who in the Pacific Northwest, and that's essentially a low budget short that's probably about a 3-minute mini documentary. But we can create things that are shorter, and that's how we work within people's budgets, right? We love collaborating with radio stations. So if you're a low budget museum, but you have connections to the radio station, there are ways for us to also like pitch to radio and say, hey, we would love to get this on your feeds. Maybe you do it the first time as we just create this content, you guys take it, but maybe in the future they will hire you. And that is something we've actually found success with, is being hired by local radio.
I think that brings up a really good point that you both kind of mentioned in different ways, is kind of how a lot of us need to switch our funding and our partners to hyper locality. Like, I've been thinking about this a lot, right? Like, that idea of us having these giant granting agencies is obviously going away. And I wondered if you guys could each speak a little bit more about just like what kind of partners you found locally, where kind of maybe our audience could look for these kind of partners, maybe off the beaten path a little bit. I mean, kind of, we know, obviously there's usually state heritage type things, but you mentioned radio stations, which made me think of, okay, well, who else would be good partners for maybe to look at that you guys have experienced when it comes to these kind of projects? Rita, do you have any experience with that at all?
Well, I mean, I mentioned, the larger museums, museums like CAM and things like that. But if you go into communities like the Venice community or the Oakwood community, I didn't know that there was a Venice History Museum that was focused on, I mean, it just, I didn't know about it because one, it just began in, let's see, we're in 2025. So I think it was 2 years ago. So they're just getting established. So it's like, even libraries should actually, I think libraries should be the connection between community organizations doing this care work and the larger organizations, the larger museums, because you have it's not Biddy Mason, you have the AC Bilbrew Library that's in the city of El Segundo, that's doing amazing work. Like, I feel like they are like a museum in themselves, because they do talks, they do these smaller displays. And so I think there is a real opportunity for us to gather information from from the local libraries that have these sort of resource centers within them. And those resource centers, they get their information. And if they're really, if the library is really good at what they do, like they are centering community, that voice is from their interactions with community. So.
That's a great point. Decca, do you have any thoughts about just other partners people could go look at or touch upon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit, it's like a different question in terms of like funding partners and history partners. But like for me, I would love, like in an ideal world, to be partnering with, like Rita's talking about with the libraries, like Brooklyn Library or Brooklyn Museum, or I think I saw somebody from the South Street Seaport here, and it's sort of like if those organizations are interested in taking this work to the next level, it is about maybe getting, like having a conversation, sitting at the table, figuring out, right? So like I have media expertise and I do have history expertise, but I don't have to reinvent the wheel if with the history, if I collaborate with these organizations that already have and hold the collections and already know the history. They can be the people who are helping us synthesize and provide summaries of a particular history to ensure that, or they can give us the oral histories that they think would relate to the work. And we can take that media and that history and that information and then create the content that needs to be created. So in terms of creative partners, it is a bit of a process. And then also in terms of thinking about financial partners, well, there are in some ways, in some places, there are some organizations out there that have a very hefty chunk of money just kind of sitting there. Certain really large landmark organizations might be the case in terms of preservation groups, but as well as universities. They can, you know, if they want to think about how to redress, and especially because universities have had a very serious history of coming through and challenging and changing the landscape. Pretty much anybody that if you can convince, it's really hard nowadays, but if you can convince somebody or a private organization that has been involved in that, whether it was back in the day and they, you know, when people who were there, it's like when it comes to like how white people tend to feel about redressing history, some people are like activists and they're like, yes, we stand with you and understand that like we didn't do this displacement ourselves, but that history has shown that that, you know, the people affiliated, similar descendants, whatever it is, have done that. So I think it's a complicated answer because right now you can't so much use the redress or and for lack of a, I'm just gonna like full disclosure, like DEI, like that is a very like hard place to have a conversation these days. But like in December, back in November, like that was a very potential. That was a potential space to really actually figure out how to find these different kinds of groups and partners to both do the creative, the development, the financial kind of components of making this work possible.
Yeah, I think it is interesting because well, especially as someone who is white and just trying to figure out like someone who is very because considered that aspect being very important to their career, you know what I mean, of being like, I come from a community that has had a lot of benefits, you know what I mean, and I don't think I feel like I have to make a role to make sure that, you know, you lift up others, right, and be it you know, race, gender, whatever. And so it is like disheartening the past couple of months to be like, okay, so what do we do to keep moving forward? But I think that, you know, thinking about that and knowing that, you know, we can still look to some organizations. And I like how you brought up the libraries, Rita, because like that, I think libraries have a really interesting space when it comes to this, because they are usually community organizations and they are there and they realize it. And there are still plenty of people trying to fight the good fight, even with all the changes happening. So I think it's just trying to figure out who those partners are and making sure that we all know we're still here, I think is incredibly important right now. Well, we have hit time. So I want to thank you both for this great program and this great conversation. I am going to go ahead and close out today's program. I will be posting this webinar as quickly as I can. Please do reach out to Decca and Rita if you have further questions. Do you guys have any final thoughts you'd like to pass along to the audience at all?
Just a heartfelt thank you. I think this has been, you know, as I wear so many hats, it's really fun to be in a space where people are doing different but similar things that I am, all with this sort of community base and really wanting to humanize the work that we do.
Mm-hmm. Same. Thank you. I think this is, it's just, you have such a great platform. And I was telling Robin this earlier. I was just like, you've got so many different kinds of people from different groups coming in. And so us being able to get in front of everybody and share what we've been doing, and also hoping that people do reach out so that we can collaborate, because I do think this work is stronger with all of us working together. Like it is, that's where my takeaway is this community work and this care work is important, but we cannot be doing it alone. And me or I think any organization. Yeah.
Completely agree. Thanks to you both. So we'll be back in July with our mystery liquids. I always like how C2C Care, we're just like, and now we're going to talk about mystery liquids next month. But I hope you do enjoy today's program. Join us for our July program, and we'll be posting updates for our upcoming programming in August, September, and October as well. So everyone have a great summer. Attempt to stay cool, and we will see you all in July. Thanks again, Decca and Rita, and we'll see you soon.